June 12, 1944. 0740 hours. Northern outskirts of Arezzo, Italy. The morning air carried a sharp smell of dust and broken plaster as the front pushed deeper into urban terrain. The Italian campaign had entered another grinding phase. The Allies advanced through streets that twisted without pattern, flanked by thick stone walls and narrow alleys that channeled every movement. German forces pulled back in measured steps, choosing where to hold and where to bleed the attackers. In these contested blocks, the SD-KFZ 251 half-track became one of the most feared threats. It moved with enough speed to surprise infantry and carried enough firepower to cut down entire squads before they could react. The vehicle's open top and thin armor suggested vulnerability, but its mobility inside these cramped streets made it lethal. Dozens of Allied units reported similar situations: short sightings, fast engagements, then sudden casualties. Mortar teams struggled to get angles. Bazooka teams often arrived seconds too late. The half-track's agility created a tactical problem with no easy answer. Private Thomas Fletcher moved through the rubble-lined street with a practiced caution. He carried no illusions about what waited around the next corner. He had watched two platoons get torn apart by a half-track only 3 days earlier. The men tried to set up a bazooka position, but the vehicle rushed through the intersection before they stabilized the tube. A burst from its mounted MG-42 ripped through the forward squad. The survivors crawled behind stonework and waited for artillery that never came. Fletcher had stood among the wounded afterward, looking at walls marked with bullet spray and at bodies that had no business lying in a place where civilians once bought bread and olives. These losses forced him to think with a clarity that bordered on desperation. The infantry needed a way to stop these machines fast. Not at range. Not after setup. They needed a method that required no heavy weapon, no long preparation, no radio call for support. They needed something immediate. Fletcher came from London. His hands carried years of skill from butcher shops where heavy carcasses swung from overhead rails and metal hooks bore weight that exceeded anything a human could lift alone. He learned early that a few inches of steel, shaped with precision, could control or stop mass that moved with force. A slipping carcass could injure or kill, so every knot and every chain mattered. He understood leverage not as theory but as the simple laws that kept him alive in work that demanded strength and technique. War forced him to recall these memories with new intensity. While others studied the silhouette of the half-track, Fletcher studied its undercarriage. He noted the exposed axle lines. He watched how the suspension dipped during turns and how the wheels carried stress when the driver accelerated through rubble. He had seen machinery fail under sudden tension in the butcher shops. If the right point could be caught, the half-track might be forced into catastrophic failure. The pattern of losses continued. Patrols advanced into tight corridors. Scouts checked corners. German crews waited for ambush openings. Once contact began, everything moved too fast. The infantry fired rifles and light machine guns that barely scratched the vehicle. Fletcher hated helplessness. He would often kneel after engagements, examine damage patterns and sketch rough diagrams in the dirt. Some men laughed, calling it pointless. Others watched silently. He kept searching for a workable weak point. He found one during an approach on the Arezzo rail yard. A disabled half-track sat abandoned after an airstrike rattled its engine block. The vehicle leaned against a wall, nose crushed by masonry, but the running gear remained intact. Fletcher crouched beneath the chassis and studied the joints. The front axle sat exposed enough that a sudden lateral wrench could shear its integrity. Not by explosives but by the vehicle's own forward momentum. Fletcher remembered the heavy steel cables used in his old shop. They were rigid yet flexible enough to coil around beams. When hooked to a sliding carcass, they stopped movement instantly. The same principle could apply here if scaled up. A steel cable with a reinforced hook might catch the axle or leaf spring of the half-track as it passed. The strain would not be from human pulling, but from the vehicle dragging the cable until the line reached full tension. The sudden force could twist metal, snap an axle, or lock the suspension. The idea felt reckless, but war forced men to accept unconventional answers. Fletcher shared the concept with his sergeant, who dismissed it as suicidal at first. But the losses continued. Doctrines that looked sensible on paper failed under real street conditions. After another brutal ambush on the next block, the sergeant told Fletcher to try his experiment. The materials came from wreckage, scrap piles, and whatever Fletcher could salvage. A squad found a coil of heavy-gauge cable near a damaged workshop. A local blacksmith, still living in the rubble, offered to heat and reshape an oversized butcher's hook that Fletcher sketched from memory. The man barely spoke English, but he understood metal and weight. His hands shaped the hook with careful strikes, thickening its curve and reinforcing the spine. Fletcher welded the hook to the cable using a field kit meant for vehicle repair. The result looked crude. It also looked strong. Now came the method. A cable stretched across a street could be spotted by any German scout. It needed concealment. Fletcher experimented by embedding the hook under loose rubble and laying the cable flat in dust. 2 riflemen positioned themselves on opposite sides of the street, ready to pull the line tight only when a vehicle approached. Early trials failed. The cable lifted unevenly. The hook snagged too early or not at all. After 4 attempts, Fletcher refined the system. He anchored one end to a broken column and assigned 2 soldiers to lift the free end at the last moment. The hook would drag under the half-track, bounce upward as the cable came under tension, and strike the axle at the exact moment the vehicle accelerated out of the corner. Fletcher tested the system on an abandoned Italian truck. The hook caught the axle and twisted it with a violent snap. The truck lurched forward and collapsed onto its damaged wheel. The men watching froze. They had never seen a simple cable stop a vehicle with such force. It planted a seed of grim hope in a unit that had seen too many hopeless positions in the narrow streets of Italy. The test provided proof. Now they had to try it in combat. June 14, 1944. 0615 hours. The low sun cast long shadows across the torn facades of Arezzo's northern blocks. Dust hung in the air like fine powder, stirred by each step of the forward elements as they advanced through streets narrowed by fallen masonry. The Germans had withdrawn overnight, but patrols reported engine noise in the direction of Via della Misericordia, a corridor known for repeated half-track ambushes. The Allied infantry moved with tense precision. Every intersection carried the threat of a sudden burst of MG-42 fire that could turn the morning into chaos. Fletcher advanced with his squad, the steel cable coiled across his shoulder, the reinforced hook wrapped in cloth to muffle its clatter. No one spoke. They all understood. The stakes. If the half-track appeared, they needed to act before the machine accelerated. A moment's hesitation would erase their chance. Fletcher briefed the men on the plan once more before taking position. 2 riflemen would hold the free end of the cable across a recessed doorway opposite the rubble pile where he anchored the fixed end. A 3rd man would watch the corner with binoculars ready to signal. Fletcher positioned the hook beneath a scattered layer of bricks and plaster chips. The concealment needed to look natural. Any sign of deliberate placement would warn the Germans. He pressed the hook deeper, adjusted the angle, and laid the cable flat against the ground. The line vanished into dust within seconds. The setup took less than a minute. The men crouched behind cover, eyes fixed on the narrow bend at the street's far end. The waiting stretched into a slow and uneasy stillness. Fletcher controlled his breathing. His mind returned to the butcher shops of his youth. He remembered the careful tension applied to cables when shifting heavy carcasses, the risk of sudden movement, the necessity of steady hands. Here the stakes were immeasurably higher. A mistake meant not a broken hook, but dead soldiers piled in a street already littered with battle scars. He watched for dust movement, engine vibration, or the rhythmic clatter of tracks on stone. After several minutes, faint metallic noise echoed between the walls. It grew louder, steady, purposeful. The Germans were approaching. The scout with binoculars lifted his hand in warning. Fletcher's squad tightened their grip on weapons. The engine noise sharpened as the half-track pushed into the bend. Sunlight glinted off its sloped armor. Its commander scanned the street with a machine gunner ready to fire at the first suspected threat. The vehicle crawled forward at a controlled pace, the driver hugging the shadowed side of the buildings. Fletcher waited until the nose of the half-track crossed the midpoint of the hook. He whispered to the riflemen. They yanked the free end upward. The cable lifted in a single fluid sweep. The hook slid under the chassis and struck the axle assembly as the vehicle accelerated out of the turn. The impact sent a metallic crack through the street. The half-track lurched violently. Its right front wheel jerked sideways. The axle twisted under the sudden torque. The vehicle ground forward for 2 meters before the joint sheared with a sharp, catastrophic snap. Metal shrieked. Weight shifted. The half-track slumped to its disabled side. The machine gunner toppled against the shield. The commander grabbed the rim and shouted orders. The driver attempted to reverse, but the damaged axle locked the wheel in place. Smoke and dust rose from the collapsed suspension. Fletcher exhaled for the first time in 10 seconds. The squad fired immediately. Rifle rounds struck the armored plates. A Bren gunner advanced from cover and placed suppressive fire across the vehicle's open top. The German crew realized their exposed position and raised their hands. The caboose section of the half-track shook from the volley, forcing the occupants to abandon their weapons. A white cloth emerged from the interior. The firefight ended in less than a minute. What remained was a disabled war machine lying crooked in the rubble, defeated by a tool built from scrap, memory, and necessity. The men gathered around the half-track, marveling at the damage. The hook remained embedded in the shattered axle housing. The cable stretched rigid across the street. The point of failure sat exactly where Fletcher predicted. He crouched to inspect the metal, noting the deformation and the way tension had distributed through the joint. The sight confirmed his understanding of leverage under stress. The infantry finally had a method that worked in their environment. It required no explosives. It required no heavy launchers. It used the enemy's own momentum to destroy itself. News traveled quickly through nearby platoons. Word reached a captain 2 blocks south by midday. He requested demonstration details from Fletcher's squad leader. Soldiers from 3 different companies gathered during a short pause in movement to examine the improvised device. They asked questions about cable thickness, hook angle, and deployment timing. Fletcher answered each with clarity gained from years in the butcher shops and from the morning's trial. He explained that the cable needed to remain invisible until the exact moment of lift. He emphasized the importance of anchoring one end to a fixed point, not a loose object. He described how the hook should strike the axle at a slight upward angle to maximize torsion. The men listened with a seriousness reserved for weapons that saved lives. Commanders debated the practicality of using such snares across multiple units. Some argued that it required precise conditions: narrow streets, blind corners, predictable vehicle routes. Others countered that those were exactly the conditions of northern Italian towns. Doctrines built for open fields failed in alleys where sight lines collapsed to 10 meters and ambush angles changed with every collapse of stone. The infantry had adapted their close-quarter tactics repeatedly during the campaign. Integrating a low-cost method that could immobilize armored personnel carriers fit the pattern of improvisation that had become essential to survival. That afternoon, Fletcher and his squad tested a second deployment on a lightly sloped corridor west of the old municipal building. This attempt used another abandoned truck to refine the reliability of the system. The hook caught again. The axle twisted under stress, though at a slightly different angle due to irregular terrain. Fletcher adjusted the cable position and recommended a deeper embed for the hook to avoid pre-contact bounce. The squad repeated the test until they achieved consistent results. Each iteration made the method more dependable. By evening, several officers acknowledged that Fletcher's snare provided something that no issued weapon could. It offered immediacy. It exploited predictable German movement patterns. It turned the terrain against the vehicle crews that relied on speed. Most important, it gave infantrymen a sense of agency in a fight that often left them powerless against armored threats. Moral shifts like these affected performance in ways that reports never captured. Men who believed they could act held ground longer. They pushed forward with more confidence. Fletcher's innovation helped give them that confidence in streets where a half-track's approach once meant retreat or death. June 15, 1944. 0540 hours. A cold breeze moved through the shattered northern districts of Arezzo as the Allied advance resumed. Morning patrols stepped over broken roof tiles and scorched timber while engineers cleared debris from the previous night's shelling. Reports indicated that German forces were preparing a counterattack to slow the advance toward the city center. Intelligence officers believed that several SDKFZ, 251 half-tracks had maneuvered into flanking positions near the district's central artery, Via del Orto. The threat forced every squad to brace for sudden armor-supported ambushes that could cut off progress within minutes. Fletcher moved with his unit through a series of alleys, the cable coiled across his shoulder once again, the hook wrapped carefully to silence its weight. The previous day's success had reached command posts across the sector. Officers asked for written notes on the method. Fletcher drafted a simple diagram that showed anchoring points, cable angle, and recommended concealment. The document circulated informally, copied by hand and pinned inside dugouts. Soldiers from other companies approached Fletcher with questions, asking how to adapt the snare to wider roads or angled terrain. He explained each variation calmly. The method required discipline, timing, and a keen understanding of how vehicles behaved under acceleration. It also required courage. A misjudged lift could expose the men to machine gun fire before the snare engaged. Still, the infantry lacked better alternatives in the confined streets. Fletcher offered what the situation demanded, not what doctrine preferred. The squad's next assignment involved securing a narrow T intersection overlooking a damaged tram line. This position sat along a primary route often used by German half-tracks to reposition troops. Patrols reported fresh track marks in the dirt near the tram rails. Fletcher studied the ground carefully. The surface carried enough loose stone to obscure a cable. A broken pillar to the right offered a firm anchor point. On the opposite wall, a collapsed balcony created a recess where riflemen could lift the line without immediate detection. Fletcher mapped the setup mentally. He instructed the men to hold fire unless the snare failed. A frontal firefight with a half-track at this range would leave little room for survival. The squad reached the intersection minutes before German engines echoed through the streets. The cable uncoiled smoothly and lay almost invisible against the rubble. Fletcher positioned the hook under a scatter of darkened bricks. He flattened the debris with his palm, ensuring the hook's curve blended with the broken edges. The rifleman crouched low, hands gripping the free end of the cable. The Bren gunner took a flanking position to strike the vehicle once immobilized. The vantage point gave him a clear line to the open troop compartment. Silence settled over the group. Fletcher steadied his breathing again, focusing on the faint vibrations of metal striking stone. Two half-tracks approached. Their engines operated in a staggered rhythm, one following the other at controlled spacing. This complicated the operation. Fletcher signaled for patience. They could only snare the first. The second would react immediately. The squad needed to act with precision, then withdraw or engage before the second vehicle could return fire. The lead half-track emerged from the right corridor, its armored nose angled slightly left to clear rubble. Dust swirled from its wheels. The commander scanned the intersection with narrowed focus. He did not expect resistance here. The vehicle accelerated to cross the tram line quickly. Fletcher whispered to lift. The rifleman hauled the cable upward. The hook vanished beneath the half-track. The axle struck it with force. A piercing metallic crack rang out. The vehicle pitched forward as its right suspension collapsed. The wheel folded under the chassis. The half-track slid sideways, scraping stone until it jammed against the tram rail. The machine gunner inside lost his grip as the mount jerked violently. The squad opened fire. The Bren gunner cut a burst across the open top. German soldiers shouted from inside. Smoke rose from the grinding metal. The second half-track braked sharply. Its commander shouted for reverse, but the narrow street prevented maneuver. The vehicle attempted to back away while three German infantrymen dismounted to return fire. Fletcher's squad engaged them in a short firefight. The Germans ducked behind a damaged fountain and fired sporadic bursts. The angle favored the Allies. Within seconds, the Germans retreated behind their half-track as it reversed out of the corridor. The enemy vehicle withdrew to regroup, leaving the disabled machine and wounded crew behind. Fletcher advanced toward the immobilized half-track cautiously. He inspected the axle once more. The hook struck the housing at a clean upward angle, exactly as intended. The impact tore the joint and locked the wheel. The vehicle lay crooked, half-rested against the tram line, its mobility destroyed. The men from his squad took positions around it and secured the crew. The Germans surrendered without argument. Their vehicle had become a coffin on wheels. Attempting to fight from it would have been suicide. By midday the event passed through command channels. Officers met Fletcher in a temporary command post set inside a damaged wine shop. They asked detailed questions about cable thickness and deployment timing. They requested estimates on the reliability of the method if used against armored cars or lighter troop carriers. Fletcher answered what he could. He stressed that the technique relied on terrain and timing. It worked best on straight approach angles where the driver accelerated after rounding a bend. He warned that open roads or wide intersections reduced effectiveness. Still, the officers recognized value in the creativity. They requested that Fletcher instruct 2 additional squads on the deployment process. Outside the shop, soldiers from other units examined the captured half-track. They ran their fingers along the shattered axle and murmured about the force needed to break it. Some wondered whether the Germans would adapt once they realized the vulnerability. Fletcher told them that any adaptation required time. New awareness meant drivers would slow down, reducing the shock effect that made half-tracks so dangerous in ambushes. Even that change benefited the infantry. A slower half-track gave more opportunity for infantry to scatter, reposition, or bring heavier weapons to bear. That evening, Fletcher walked alone through a silent alley lined with shattered windows and abandoned carts. He looked at the cable draped over his shoulder and understood the strange nature of innovation born in war. A butcher's tool had become a weapon that saved soldiers. He did not feel pride. He felt a sober acceptance of necessity. War stripped people of the lives they once led, Yet pieces of those lives returned when least expected. In his case, the years spent lifting carcasses and managing weight had surfaced to meet a problem that doctrine could not solve. Later that night he met with the squad to review the operation. They discussed what worked and what needed refinement. Fletcher recommended a faster lift to reduce early detection. He suggested anchoring the cable slightly lower to improve angle of contact. The men nodded, understanding the precision required. They knew the next engagement could arrive at any hour. June 17, 1944. 0640 hours. Dawn light crept across the cracked stone walls of eastern Arezzo as the Allied infantry prepared to push deeper into the contested districts. The previous days had shown a pattern. Each German withdrawal created narrow windows of advance before counterattacks struck from unpredictable angles. Half-tracks remained the centerpiece of these counterattacks. Their speed allowed them to seize alleys before infantry could establish firing positions. Their armor shielded machine gunners who swept corridors with devastating bursts. Fletcher's cable snare offered a partial answer, but he knew its effectiveness depended on conditions that shifted every hour. Rainfall hardened or softened debris. Shelling altered street angles. Rubble piles collapsed under weight. He studied each location with a practiced eye, knowing that a misjudged angle could turn a calculated tactic into a fatal gamble. The squad's next target lay near the old Civic Archive building, a block of heavy stone that had survived multiple bombardments. Intelligence indicated that German forces had fortified positions inside the structure while using half-tracks to ferry ammunition through the adjoining lanes. Fletcher studied the map. The eastern approach formed a narrow funnel that curved into a blind corner. This geometry favored the snare. He instructed the men to move quickly and quietly. The cable lay coiled across his back. The hook remained wrapped in cloth to hide its shape and prevent clatter. Each man understood their role with practiced calm. They reached the corner by 0710 hours. The air carried faint vibrations from engines somewhere beyond the buildings. Fletcher examined the debris along the road. The ground near the left wall had accumulated a layer of finer rubble from a collapsed roof. This texture provided ideal concealment for the cable. Opposite it, a broken column stood firm enough to anchor the fixed end. Fletcher crouched, unwrapped the hook, and placed it beneath a thin cluster of stone fragments. He ensured the curve faced upward at the correct angle. The riflemen took their positions. The Bren gunner waited behind a collapsed window frame, ready to fire at the moment of immobilization. Minutes later, the sound of an engine echoed between the walls. Fletcher recognized the rhythm immediately. A half-track operated in low gear, preparing to accelerate through the turn. German tactics favored sudden bursts of speed when entering open stretches. Fletcher signaled the men to prepare. The hook sat perfectly hidden. The cable lay flat, melding with dust. The squad breathed in unison as the vehicle approached the corner. The armored nose appeared. Sunlight glinted across the front plate. The driver corrected slightly to clear a fallen beam. The commander scanned the street while gripping the mounted MG-42. The half-track accelerated. Fletcher whispered the command. The rifleman lifted the cable. The hook slid under the chassis. A sharp metallic crack split the air as the axle absorbed the full tension. The vehicle jolted, pitching its right side downward. The suspension failed instantly. The half-track skidded sideways, grinding into the wall and throwing dust into the air. The machine gunner attempted to fire a burst. The sudden tilt disrupted his aim. Bullets struck the stone above Fletcher's position. The Bren gunner responded with a controlled volley across the open compartment, forcing the German crew to duck. The driver tried to keep the vehicle upright, but the twisted axle locked the wheel at an impossible angle. Within seconds, the half-track became a stationary target. The Germans raised their hands. Two infantrymen inside shouted for medical help for a wounded comrade struck during the collapse. Fletcher ordered the squad to hold fire while they secured the prisoners. He knelt beside the damaged axle once more. The impact produced a cleaner break than previous engagements. The hook remained embedded in the joint. The cable stretched taut across the street. Fletcher touched the metal to examine heat buildup. The deformation followed the exact pattern he expected. The force of the half-track's own acceleration had multiplied the tension through the line, delivering catastrophic failure to the running gear. The men around him murmured their approval. The method continued to prove reliable under varied conditions. By midday, a larger force assembled to storm the Civic Archive building. Fletcher joined the approach team. The snare had already removed one of the German mobility assets, leaving the defenders with fewer options for reinforcement or evacuation. Urban combat intensified as squads advanced through hallways lined with toppled shelves and documents scattered across the floor. German resistance inside the archive proved determined but isolated. Without vehicle support, their firepower and maneuver options diminished. After a 2-hour engagement, the building fell to Allied control. Word of another successful deployment spread again. Officers visited Fletcher to request that he train an additional platoon in cable handling and timing. He agreed. They selected a partially collapsed courtyard near the front lines as a training site. Fletcher demonstrated how to coil the cable for rapid deployment. He explained why the hook's angle mattered. He showed them how early or late lifts produced glancing strikes instead of axle shears. Soldiers practiced the motion repeatedly, dragging a salvaged axle assembly across the courtyard to simulate movement. The training produced mixed results at first. Timing required instinct born from observation. Fletcher corrected posture and grip until movements became fluid. During a short break, a lieutenant asked Fletcher why he believed such a simple design worked where complex weapons sometimes failed. Fletcher answered plainly. Machines carried predictable points of weakness. Armor protected crews, but mobility depended on exposed mechanical systems vulnerable to sudden forces. A heavy weapon aimed at the hull often missed or struck at poor angles. A cable that used the enemy's speed against them struck with absolute certainty when timed correctly. The lieutenant nodded, understanding the engineering logic behind the tactic. That evening, Fletcher returned to the perimeter where the half-track lay immobilized. Engineers prepared to tow the wreckage for scrap analysis. Fletcher inspected the hook again. Despite striking multiple vehicles across several days, the reinforced curve remained intact. The metal showed stress lines but no cracks. This durability impressed the engineers, who asked for permission to take measurements. Fletcher agreed and provided details about the blacksmith who shaped the hook. They discussed forging methods and tempering processes that increased the steel's resilience. As night fell, the squad gathered around a dim lantern to discuss upcoming operations. Fletcher cautioned that the Germans might soon recognize the pattern. If they suspected cable snares, they would adjust by reducing speed or clearing intersections with dismounted infantry. The men accepted this possibility. Innovation created temporary advantages in war. Eventually the enemy adapted. The key was to use the tactic effectively before that adaptation became widespread. June 19, 1944. 0605 hours. Allied forces pressed deeper into the central districts of Arezzo as German resistance intensified. The city's narrow arteries and sloping streets produced shifting choke points where engagements erupted without warning. By now, Fletcher's cable snare had spread through several forward companies as an unofficial tool, passed by word of mouth and copied in hand-drawn diagrams taped inside foxholes and ration crates. Officers treated it as an improvisation suited for specific terrain rather than formal doctrine, yet its value had become undeniable. Infantrymen who once retreated at the first growl of a half-track now held their positions with guarded confidence. Fletcher's squad advanced along Via Sant'Agostino, a corridor cut by intersecting alleys that offered ideal terrain for ambushes from either side. German counterattacks the previous evening confirmed that at least 3 half-tracks operated in this sector. Their mobility allowed them to exploit gaps in the Allied push and deliver troops into isolated pockets of resistance. Fletcher paused near a broken drainage culvert and studied the layout. The street kinked sharply 10 meters ahead. A half-track rounding the bend at speed would have little time to react to a hidden snare. The squad prepared the cable once more. Fletcher placed the hook under a thin crust of debris that blended with the surrounding stone. The anchor point sat firm within the fractured base of a collapsed storefront. Engine noise approached from the west. The vibrations matched the signature of a half-track moving at combat speed. Fletcher whispered instructions to the riflemen holding the free end. They crouched low, gripping the line with steady hands. The Bren gunner positioned himself behind a fractured archway. The half-track's front plate emerged as it cleared the bend. The machine gunner scanned the street, unaware of the danger beneath him. Fletcher signaled. The rifleman hauled the cable upward. The hook vanished under the chassis and struck metal with brutal force. A sharp metallic snap cut through the air. The half-track's right wheel locked instantly. The vehicle swerved, tore into the wall, and halted in a violent lurch. Dust exploded outward. The gunner fell from his mount as the compartment tilted. The squad fired a short volley to suppress the crew. The Germans shouted and raised their hands. The immobilized vehicle became a captured asset within seconds. Fletcher inspected the axle again. The brake ran clean along the angle he predicted. The hook sat wedged deep inside the joint. It reinforced everything he believed about mechanical stress under sudden tension. As the squad secured the prisoners, a distant engine roared from the alley to the south. A second half-track accelerated toward the intersection. The squad scrambled for cover. German doctrine often paired vehicles during advance operations. Fletcher's instinct told him that the enemy intended to recover or support the disabled machine. The street allowed no space for another snare. The men prepared for a direct firefight. The second half-track braked sharply when it sighted the immobilized vehicle. Its commander shouted orders. German infantry dismounted and advanced cautiously. The squad engaged them in controlled bursts. The firefight lasted several tense minutes. Allied reinforcements arrived from the rear and pressed the Germans back. The second half-track reversed and withdrew under covering fire. The brief clash demonstrated an important truth. The snare worked, but it required the correct conditions. When those conditions vanished, the infantry still relied on conventional tactics. Fletcher understood this balance. His method offered advantage, not immunity. Later that morning, a major from battalion headquarters visited Fletcher. He requested a full explanation of the tactics' development, usage, and reliability. Fletcher described the butcher shops of London, the hooks used to secure carcasses, and the principles of leverage that guided his idea. The major listened intently. He noted that such innovations rarely emerged from manuals. They came from experience, observation, and necessity. He asked whether the tactic could scale to other environments. Fletcher responded that open countryside rendered it ineffective. Urban terrain created its opportunity. Narrow alleys forced vehicles into predictable angles. Stone walls hid the cable. Speed amplified the force. Outside towns, these advantages vanished. The major nodded, understanding the constraints. He thanked Fletcher and left to report to headquarters. Rumors spread that higher command wanted to include a note about the technique in field briefings for urban operations. The method would not become formal doctrine, but units advancing into similar terrain might benefit from the knowledge. Soldiers respected innovations that saved lives, regardless of whether they carried official status. During a brief pause, Fletcher returned to the disabled half-track. Engineers documented the damage for technical study. They measured the angle of the brake and examined the stress lines. One engineer remarked that the axle looked as if it had been twisted by a mechanical press rather than a battlefield strike. Fletcher explained how momentum acted through the cable to multiply force beyond what men alone could exert. The engineers photographed the hook and noted the blacksmith's reinforcing technique. They planned to replicate a few for wider testing. By afternoon, the German positions in central Arezzo began to crumble. Their half-track support weakened after multiple losses and increasing caution. Drivers reduced speed at intersections, often sending infantry ahead to check corners. This change slowed the enemy's mobility and weakened their ability to strike fast. Such tactical shifts benefited the Allies even when no snare was deployed. Pressure mounted as the infantry pushed deeper into the district. The battle evolved from sudden armored ambushes into more predictable exchanges of fire across short distances. As the day ended, Fletcher sat with his squad behind a collapsed terrace overlooking the city's central square. They rested, rifles across their knees, dust coating their uniforms. The talk turned to the strange way civilian skills resurfaced in war. A former carpenter explained how he used knowledge of joints and angles to fortify makeshift barricades. A mechanic described how pre-war experience with engine timing helped him diagnose captured vehicles. Fletcher listened quietly. He did not seek praise. The snare had grown from necessity, not ambition. In the days that followed, the front shifted north. Fletcher's unit took part in operations farther from dense urban centers. The terrain changed. Wide fields and rolling hills replaced the tight corridors of Arezzo. The cable saw fewer opportunities for use. The snare remained coiled in Fletcher's pack, ready but silent. Soldiers still asked him about it, curious about its origin, impressed by its effectiveness, amused at its simplicity. Fletcher responded with the same calm explanation each time. It worked because the battlefield offered the perfect stage. Terrain turned a butcher's hook into an anti-vehicle tool. Without that terrain, it became a length of steel again. Weeks later, after the Allies secured the region, the story of the hooked cable traveled among companies as a small legend. It did not reach the level of formal recognition. No medals were awarded for its invention. No reports credited Fletcher by name in official summaries. But men remembered. They told the story to new recruits around cook fires. They pointed to diagrams sketched in dirt. They explained how a simple tool had stopped armored machines when nothing else nearby could. Fletcher survived the war. He returned to London and resumed work as a butcher. His hands again lifted carcasses, tightened knots, and managed weight with practiced ease. Customers never knew that the same skills once stopped German half-tracks in the narrow streets of an Italian city. He seldom spoke of it. The war lived behind his eyes, quiet and heavy. He knew the snare had saved men who would otherwise never have returned home. That knowledge stayed with him as he grew older. His squadmates remembered him differently. Years later, they recalled a man who looked at problems with steady focus, who saw opportunity where others saw dead ends, who understood that survival sometimes depended on simple ideas applied at the right moment. They knew that war honored ingenuity unevenly. Some innovations filled manuals. Others lived in memory. Fletcher's snare belonged to memory. Yet its impact remained real. It slowed enemy assaults. It saved infantry lives. It demonstrated how a man shaped by ordinary labor could influence the course of battle with a single cable and a reinforced hook.